Listen to me very carefully. If you are making minimum payments on every debt you have and treating all of them as though they were equally dangerous, you are not being responsible. You are destroying wealth slowly enough that it still feels respectable. That is what makes it so dangerous. Most people were taught one blunt rule about debt. Debt is bad. Pay it off as fast as possible. That rule sounds clean, it sounds moral, it sounds like the kind of advice a prudent person should follow without thinking too hard about it. And yet some of the worst financial decisions I have ever seen were made by people trying to follow exactly that rule. They overpaid the wrong debts, ignored the true cost of money, missed the best compounding years of their lives, gave up employer matching money, underfunded retirement accounts, left liquid capital trapped in low-yield paydowns, and all the while they were telling themselves they were being disciplined. That is the tragedy. The action felt wise, the result was expensive. I want to say something plainly at the beginning. Not all debt is created equal. Some debt is poison, some debt is pressure, some debt is tolerable, and some debt, used correctly, is actually one of the cheapest forms of capital you will ever touch in your life. If you cannot distinguish among those categories, then every paycheck becomes a little war between guilt and ignorance. You throw money at the account that offends you emotionally, instead of the debt that actually deserves to be attacked. That is how decades of wealth building potential get burned up by people who think they are doing the right thing. I have spent my life around money, around businesses, around asset allocation, around people who became rich, around people who earned plenty and still somehow never got ahead. And one thing becomes obvious after enough years. Wealth is not built by hatred of debt. It is built by understanding the true cost of capital and directing each dollar to the place where it has the highest long-term return. That is what most households never learn. They do not have a capital allocation framework. They have feelings. The mortgage feels large. The student loans feel shameful. The car payment feels annoying. The credit cards feel urgent. Everything blends into one emotional pile. Then they attack whatever bothers them most, instead of what is mathematically most dangerous. That is backward. And backward money behavior almost always leads to a backward financial life. So I want to give you a different framework, a calmer one, a richer one, a framework that asks a better question every time a dollar shows up in your life. Where will this dollar do the most work? Not where will it make me feel cleanest tonight? Where will it do the most work? That is how adults build wealth. That is how capital thinks. That is how you stop being somebody who pays bills and start becoming somebody who allocates money. The first debt I want you to stop aggressively paying down is a low-interest mortgage. And I can already hear the resistance. People were taught that the house should be paid off as fast as possible. Parents said it, neighbors said it, financial personalities have said it for years. Be debt-free, own your home outright, then you are safe. I understand the emotional appeal. What I care about is the arithmetic. If you locked in a mortgage anywhere around 2.5%, 3%, 3.5%, even 4% in the last decade, you have some of the cheapest long-term money most ordinary people will ever see in their lifetime. That is not a burden to attack blindly. That is a financial tool. And the real mistake is not having a low-interest mortgage. The real mistake is taking scarce extra cash and earning only your mortgage rate with it when the same cash placed elsewhere intelligently could have produced much more over time. This is the part people dislike because it attacks a deeply held moral intuition. They think paying down debt is automatically productive. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is simply a low-return use of capital dressed up as virtue. If you send an extra $500 a month toward a 3.5% mortgage, you are effectively earning a 3.5% return on that $500 by avoiding future interest. That is the math, not zero, not worthless, but 3.5%. Now compare that to the long-run historical return of the broad market. No guarantees in any given year, of course. But over long periods, the S&P 500 has returned roughly 10% annually. Some periods less, some periods more. The exact number matters less than the spread. The spread is the whole point. If one option produces something in the neighborhood of 3.5% and another historically has produced something in the neighborhood of 10%, then your problem is not emotional purity. Your problem is opportunity cost. That is the most underappreciated cost in personal finance, not what money cost you directly, what you gave up by placing it in the wrong place. Over 20 years, that difference compounds into something enormous. Not a little gap, a life-changing one. The extra payment you made to feel secure may have cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars in foregone compounding. And here is the part most people never think through. If you overpay the mortgage aggressively, the extra money disappears into home equity. Home equity can be real wealth. It can also be trapped wealth. If something happens and you need liquidity, you do not tap home equity as easily as people imagine. You may need to sell, you may need a new loan, you may need permission from a lender at exactly the moment. Lenders are least generous. The person who kept more of that money liquid in investments has choices. The person who stuffed every extra dollar into the house has a larger percentage of his net worth nailed to the floor. I am not telling you to take on more housing debt recklessly. I am telling you to stop confusing low-cost leverage with an emergency. If your mortgage rate is below 5%, the better move for many households is to make the required payment and direct extra dollars toward assets with higher expected returns. That is how capital thinks. Not all ownership is equal. Owning more house earlier is not automatically superior to owning more productive assets outside the house. Sometimes it is materially worse. Now let me be careful, because I do not like lazy slogans any more than I like lazy debt advice. If your mortgage is high rate, adjustable, or financially oppressive, that is a different conversation. If your monthly housing payment is crushing the rest of the balance sheet, that is a different conversation. But for the huge number of people sitting on low fixed rates, aggressive prepayment is often one of the quietest wealth killers in the entire household. The second debt I want you to stop aggressively paying down is federal student loans, especially fixed-rate federal loans in the mid-single digits. Again, this will offend people who think debt advice should always flatter their sense of sacrifice. Good. What I care about is whether the sacrifice is intelligently directed. I have watched young people spend their most powerful compounding years trying to eliminate federal student loan balances while building almost no retirement assets. That is not discipline. That is a tragic misunderstanding of time. The money you invest in your 20s is not the same as the money you invest in your 40s. The dollar amount may be identical. The life impact is not. A dollar invested early is buying decades. A dollar invested late is buying leftovers. That is why so much retirement pain is really time pain. The person who spent 15 years throwing every extra dollar at student loans and ignored retirement accounts did not only lose some returns, he lost the one thing markets cannot restore later at scale, front-loaded compounding. That is why I get impatient when people repeat generic debt mantras to the young. A person in his 20s or early 30s with federal student loans at 4%, 5%, maybe 6%, no retirement savings, and an employer match he is not capturing should not be praised for making triple loan payments. He should be warned. Because every dollar he sends to that loan instead of to a matched retirement account is a dollar that may be refusing an immediate 50% or 100% return from the employer and decades of tax. Advantage compounding. After that, that is madness. I do not care how emotionally satisfying debt-free sounds. You cannot call it good strategy if it means rejecting free money. And that is exactly what many people do. They say, I want to get the student loan off my back first. Fine. Then they wake up at 45 with the loan gone and the retirement account embarrassingly thin. At that point, the emotional relief is real, so is the financial damage. Now let me be specific. I am talking about federal student loans, not every private student loan under the sun. Federal loans often come with protections that matter: income-driven plans, forbearance structures, potential forgiveness routes depending on profession and policy. A different kind of risk profile than a private lender whose only language is collection. That does not mean federal loans are a gift. It means they are not always the 5-alarm fire people imagine. So here is the correct sequence for many households. Make the required federal loan payment. Always. Do not damage your credit casually. Do not pretend the debt does not exist. But before sending extra money to a 5% federal loan, capture every dollar of employer match available in your 401k. That is first. Then build a real emergency fund. 3 to 6 months of expenses in cash or near cash. Not because it is glamorous, because life always takes a turn when people are least prepared. And the absence of a cash buffer is what often pushes people right back into truly toxic debt. Then fund tax advantage vehicles like a Roth IRA if you are eligible. Then continue building retirement assets consistently. Only after those pieces are in place should you even begin asking whether extra student loan payments deserve your remaining surplus. And for many people, the answer will still be no, because a diversified long-term portfolio and tax-sheltered compounding may still be the superior use of those dollars. Again, the point is not that student loans are wonderful. The point is that attacking them first can be extraordinarily expensive if it comes at the cost of retirement formation. This is one of the places where poor people advice and rich people behavior diverge dramatically. Poor people advice says eliminate the visible burden as fast as possible. Rich people behavior says allocate capital to the highest return use first, then work down the stack. That is a very different way of thinking. Now, the third debt I want you to stop aggressively paying down is a low-interest auto loan. Here again, we have to separate emotional irritation from mathematical danger. People hate car payments. I understand it. A car is a depreciating asset. The payment arrives every month. It reminds you that money is leaving for something that becomes less valuable over time, that makes people want to kill the payment as fast as possible. What matters is the rate, not the annoyance. If you financed a car at 2%, 3%, 4%, maybe even 4.5%, you are again sitting on cheap money relative to what capital can often earn elsewhere over long periods. That does not mean go out and buy an absurd car. That does not mean stretch your budget because financing feels cheap. I am talking about what to do once the low-rate loan already exists. And the answer, if your balance sheet is otherwise sane, is usually not to pour extra cash into prepaying it. Why? Because the same opportunity cost problem shows up again. Every extra $200 you push toward a 3% car loan is a 3% use of capital. It may feel adult, it may feel tidy, it may also be inferior to investing that same amount in a diversified portfolio, funding a tax-advantaged account, or building liquidity that protects you from much worse debt later. The mistake people make with auto loans is they think depreciation alone proves early payoff is wise. Number depreciation is already happening whether you overpay or not. The question is whether the extra dollar should be sent to a low-rate obligation tied to a depreciating asset or whether it should be directed toward productive assets that compound. Those are different questions, and once you ask the right one, the answer often changes. If the auto rate is low, make the required payment. Do not make the emotional payment. That is the better rule. Keep the cash flow available for higher return deployment. And remember something else. Liquidity matters in a stressful year. The person with invested assets and emergency reserves has flexibility. The person who rushed to eliminate every cheap monthly payment may have less formal debt but also less maneuverability. That is not a small distinction. Money is not only about minimizing monthly obligations. It is about preserving options. Options are one of the most valuable financial assets in the world. Now, after I tell people to stop aggressively paying down those three categories of cheap debt, they always ask the same question. Fine, then what do I do with the money instead? That is the right question. And the answer is not vague. It should follow a very strict hierarchy. First, capture employer match. This is non-negotiable to me. If your company will match part of your 401k contribution and you are not taking the full match, you are refusing part of your compensation. People will spend hours comparing whether to put an extra $300 into a mortgage or a student loan and then walk straight past a guaranteed 50% or 100% return through the employer plan. That is financial illiteracy wearing the clothes of seriousness. Take the match first. Always. Second, build the emergency fund. Not because cash is exciting, because cash is defense. Because the real purpose of an emergency fund is not yield. It is preventing the next mistake. A person without reserves becomes a person who uses credit cards for shocks, personal loans for repairs, and desperation for decision making. That is how financial systems weaken. An emergency fund does not make you rich. It protects the process that can make you rich. That is just as important. Third, fund the Roth IRA if you qualify. I cannot say this strongly enough. The Roth structure is one of the most generous compounding tools available to ordinary Americans. Pay taxes now. Let the money grow, take it out later tax-free. If you follow the rules, that is beautiful. That is how you use the law to preserve more of the upside your discipline creates. People underuse it because it feels boring. Boring is where wealth lives. Fourth, continue building retirement assets beyond the match and the Roth. Traditional 401k, broad market index funds, diversified long-term holdings. The point is not to become clever. The point is to become relentless. Consistent, automatic, boring enough that the money keeps moving without asking your emotions for permission every month. Then, and only then, should you think about whether you want to direct more money toward moderate rate debts for psychological or cash flow reasons. Do not get the order wrong. The order is the whole game. Now, I want to say a word about dividend paying assets because the source pushes there. and I understand why. There is something psychologically powerful about money arriving without labor each month or quarter, dividends, distributions, and income. Producing assets can change the emotional relationship a person has with saving and investing because the machine starts feeling alive. It is not only a pile growing on a statement, it becomes a source of cash flow that matters. But I do not want you confusing the wrapper with the principle. The principle is asset accumulation. The goal is productive ownership. If you build a dividend portfolio intelligently over time, good. If you use broad market index funds first and only later build toward income, also good. The essential thing is that extra money released from cheap debt is not supposed to drift into lifestyle. It is supposed to get drafted into asset. Building, that is the whole point of stopping the wrong prepayments. You are not freeing cash to spend more. You are freeing cash to build. That is a moral difference. And now we come to the debt you actually should fear, high interest consumer debt. This is the debt I want you to attack with total seriousness. Credit card balances carried month to month, payday loans, personal loans at ugly rates, buy now pay, ladder traps that quietly accumulate into a life built on installments. This is where the game changes completely. If you are paying 18%, 22%, 25%, 29% on revolving consumer debt, none of the earlier logic applies the same way. This is not cheap leverage. This is financial rot. This is the kind of debt that compounds against you faster than most honest investments compound for you. You do not strategically carry a 25% credit card balance. You remove it aggressively. Without romance, without excuses, because every month it remains alive, it is working for the lender and against your future. This is where the return math becomes beautifully simple. Paying off a 25% card is equivalent to earning a guaranteed 25% return on that money. Risk-free, no stock market required, no lucky year, no special timing. You remove the liability and the compounding bleed stops. There are very few guaranteed moves in finance. This is one of them. That is why I draw the line around 8%. Cheap debt below roughly 5% is one discussion. Moderate debt in the middle deserves judgment. Debt above 8%, especially unsecured consumer debt, is where I stop being nuanced. Now it is enemy capital. Now it must go. This is where people often get confused because they hear the first part of the argument and use it as an excuse. You said debt is a tool. Yes, some debt at some prices in some structures, under some conditions. Not all debt. A scalpel is a tool. A tumor is not. You must know the difference. That is what strategic finance is. Discrimination, the inability to discriminate among debts, is what keeps people broke. They overpay the useful loans and underreact to the toxic ones. Then they wonder why their assets never get traction. The money is being allocated backward. So here is the correct aggression pattern. List every debt, write the balance, write the rate, write the minimum, and then strip away the names and emotional stories. A mortgage is not automatically noble. A student loan is not automatically shameful. A car loan is not automatically foolish. A credit card is not automatically catastrophic if paid in full monthly. The only honest starting point is price. What is the money costing you? Once you know the rate, the hierarchy becomes visible. Destroy the high-interest consumer debt. First, maintain the cheap debt. Redirect surplus into assets. That is the system. Not perfect, not emotionally satisfying every day, but effective. And effective over enough years is what creates the thing people are actually after: freedom. Now let me say one more thing people need to hear. Being debt-free is not the same as being wealthy. This may be the single most important emotional correction in the entire discussion. I have known people who proudly announced they were debt-free and yet owned almost no productive assets, no meaningful investments, no dividend flow, no substantial retirement base, no real capital working for them. They were debt-free. They were not free. That is an enormous distinction. You can eliminate every loan in your life and still be financially weak if all you did was clear obligations without building assets. You can also carry some low-cost debt and be extraordinarily strong if your assets, cash flow, and options are expanding faster than the obligations are constraining you. Wealth is not the absence of monthly payments. It is the presence of productive ownership. That is the standard always. So if you take nothing else from me, take this. Stop treating debt as a moral category and start treating it as a capital allocation problem. Ask what it costs. Ask what the alternative use of the money could earn. Ask whether the debt is cheap, moderate, or toxic. Ask whether paying it early increases freedom or merely increases your feeling of cleanliness while reducing your compounding power? Those are the right questions. That is how rich people think. Not because they love debt, because they understand the cost of money better than the public does. And understanding the cost of money is one of the cleanest paths I know from middle-class effort to actual wealth. So let me leave you with the full blueprint in the cleanest order possible. Stop aggressively paying extra toward low-interest mortgage debt. If the rate is below 5%, stop aggressively overpaying fixed-rate federal student loans while neglecting retirement formation. Stop aggressively paying down low-interest auto loans if the rate is cheap and your balance sheet is otherwise healthy. Take the released cash and deploy it in this order. Capture every dollar of employer match, build the emergency fund, fund the Roth IRA if eligible, continue building retirement and taxable investment assets, and destroy high-interest consumer debt with everything you have. That is the sequence. That is the discipline. That is how capital gets directed intelligently. And the moment you start doing that, you stop being a person merely paying obligations. You become a person building assets. That shift changes everything, not overnight, over time, which is exactly how real wealth is built.